The Ontario NDP is holding a news conference on transit safety at Queen's Park right now. Let's listen in.
Happening on unceded Indigenous territory that has been unceded for generations. So we thank the Mississaugas of the First Credit, many other nations for their friendship, and we hope today, in the message we're sending to the province, that work of making sure our communities are safe continues. I want to acknowledge that we have with us transit leaders, transit union leaders from across this province. You're going to hear from some of them soon. John Donino is here, National President of ATU Canada. Crystal Cato, EA to the National President, is here. Marvin Alfred, President of ATU 113, TTC Workers, is here. Frank Malta, here from ATU 113. Renee Coutinho, ATU National Staff, is here. Eric Tuck, President of ATU Local 107 from Hamilton. Chuck Fitzpatrick, ATU Local 279 from Ottawa. Harik Ball, ATU Local 279 from Ottawa. Jacques Racine, ATU Local 279 from Ottawa. Jay Kawaja from ATU 1572 Mississauga. Jack Jackson, ATU 1572 Mississauga. Jamie Larkin from ATU 1760 Ottawa. Andrew Salaby, ATU 1573 Brampton. And Amandeep Gill, ATU 1573 Brampton. We have the experts in the People's House today to talk about public transit. But before we introduce some of our leaders, I want to pass it off to my friend, Butila Karpache, MPP for Parkdale High Park.
Good morning. I'm Butila Karpache, NDP MPP for Parkdale High Park and the official opposition critic for GTA issues. Last week, I attended the vigil in High Park in memory of Gabriel Magalhaes. I met his mother, Andrea, who told me she wants to see change. It was the same message she has been speaking about with great clarity and strength at a time of tremendous grief and loss. As Andrea has said repeatedly, more must be done to prevent people from reaching a point of crisis. We need to take action on the social determinants of health. We need to provide more mental health supports. We need to provide more housing. As we walked from High Park Gates to Keele subway station, a constituent of mine shared with me that she lives between High Park Station and Keele Station. And given the recent violent incidents in both of these stations, she tries to avoid transit whenever she can. She's not the only one. This is what is going through the minds of many people who use public transit. It is driving people away from our public transit system. Just a few months ago, 2 women were stabbed at High Park Station, and one of them, Vanessa Krupowska, died. Last June, Yima Doma, with ties to Parkdale's Tibetan community, was set on fire on a bus at Kipling Station and died. These are the ones that are connected to my community of Parkdale High Park. But we know that there are many more that have happened across the city. This has to stop. Transit riders and workers alike do not feel safe on transit. Everyone should feel safe on public transit. This should be a wake-up call for the Ford Conservative government that urgent action is needed. I urge Premier Ford to listen to Gabriel's mother, Andrea, and make the immediate investments needed in housing and mental health services, to work with the City of Toronto and transit workers to ensure safety for everyone, and to restore confidence in our transit system, and as Andrea said, to bring change. Thank you. Now I'm going to pass it on to John Donino, National President of ATU Canada.
Thank you. Well, good morning. My name is John Donino. I'm the National President for the Amalgamated Transit Union in Canada. We are here today to address the ongoing and escalating acts of violence on public transit, not just in Toronto, but quite frankly across this country. Joining me today are ATU representatives from across the province of Ontario. The people of Ontario and across Canada deserve transit free from fear and violence. Violence on public transit has been an issue for decades, but over the last number of years, at unprecedented levels. Frontline transit workers are getting assaulted with deadly weapons. Passengers are getting murdered on platforms in subway cars. And the provincial government just doesn't give a damn. On February the 22nd, 2022, we held a press conference in Toronto with demands for better protection, which fell on deaf ears. Assaults on public transit workers are being reported at well over 2,000 yearly occurrences, and those are just the ones which capture aggravated assaults, serious injury, or even death. The reality is that far more instances go unreported yearly. Earlier this year, ATU Canada called for the implementation of a national task force, in concert with the provinces to address transit violence. The response from this premier has been meaningless, to say the least. Repeatedly, Doug Ford expresses sympathy and condolences to the victims of violence with no real plan to address the issues other than increased policing. Transportation Minister Mulroney has gone missing on this file, has not made a single comment or effort to tackle the issues under her portfolio. Doug Ford's platform has been for the people. So where is he and his government on this important issue? We understand that the effort requires a complex approach to deal with the issues and involves many stakeholders coming together. Unfortunately, this government has not tried to tackle the issue, leaving Ontarians to ride public transit in fear or stop riding the systems altogether. What good is billions of dollars of capital funding for transit infrastructure where workers and passengers are getting attacked, accosted, and killed? Shining new stations and fancy new buses don't keep riders safe, but operational dollars will. Violence on transit is complex. Policing is not the only solution. The root cause of the increasing violence may be attributed to the closure of homeless shelters, crisis centers, the underfunding of mental health resources, and the retention of frontline crisis workers. The problem on our streets inevitably overflows onto the buses, streetcars, and subways. The failure to deal with these critical social issues is forcing distressed and dangerous individuals into no destination riders and into a collision course with the riding public and our members, the workers. It's all contributing to a cycle of violence. We want to be clear that not all acts of violence are committed by those individuals living in crisis or in tough economic times. In fact, this is not an individual issue in most circumstances, but rather a failure of society and government. As Ontarians struggle to make ends meet, deal with the societal issues and mental health, we cannot continue to ignore these signs. It is our ethical and moral responsibility to tackle these issues. ATU Canada has been calling for enhanced efforts to curb the escalation of violence repeatedly, but unfortunately with little or no response from all levels of government. The repeated call for action today involves working towards a national task force led by the provinces and should be a priority for this government here in Ontario. ATU remains committed to working in a collaborative way to deal with the social economic impacts as we continue to rebuild communities and recover from the effects of this pandemic. In order to rebuild vibrant and safe communities, we need to offer safe spaces like public transit, because public transit is a mobility right for all Canadians. Transit intersects in many different ways and services vulnerable communities, those living with disabilities, getting people to medical appointments, and as part of their daily commute to and from work. Municipalities continue to struggle with funding shortfalls and low ridership levels. The need for the operational dollars is needed now more than ever as cities continue to cut service, increase fares, and force riders to seek alternative means of transportation because they don't feel safe. This ultimately leads to the downward spiral or death of a much-needed service and the mobility right of Ontarians. ATU Canada remains steadfast in its willingness to working with this government to restore confidence in public transit and to keep this province moving while keeping transit workers and our riders safe. ATU transit professionals want nothing more but to continue to provide safe, reliable, affordable, and accessible transit to all riders who so dearly depend on it every day. Thank you for that. What I am going to do is I'm going to just hand it over to our ATU Local 113 President, Marvin Alford, who is the representative here in the City of Toronto for transit workers. I think it's important to hear the perspective of what's happening in the City of Toronto on our transit system. And I just want to make it clear, though, this is a countrywide problem. This is a national crisis. But we are here in Toronto, so it's only fitting that Marvin comes to the podium and speaks on some of the issues in the TTC.
Thank you, John. Good morning, everybody. Again, I'm Marvin Alfred, President of ATU Local 113 here in Toronto. I will speak to the Toronto issues, but I just wanted to highlight at first that the difficult conversations need to be had regarding funding for transit. It's not a cost, it's an investment in transit, not just in service, in safety, investment in people. We need to change the mindset and the vocabulary that spending in transit is not a cost, it's an investment. Here in Toronto, we've been dealing with a lot of things that have been going on lately that have been highlighted in media. We've had tragic loss of life repeatedly. This past a couple weekends ago, we had a young individual that passed away. And the impact of such a loss of life doesn't just impact the family, with our condolences to the family. There's transit workers involved that were there to respond. One of the first people there are impacted as well, not just them and their families. Repeatedly in the last couple of years, we've dealt with a number of tragedies in the system. Transit workers, they're comforting somebody when they're having a distress after being the victim of a violent act. It affects everybody. The emotional impact does not leave that individual. Comforting that individual should not be something that we're getting used to. My concern is we're getting used to these acts of violence that are happening, and there's politicians that are hoping it just goes away. Right now it's in the media, but it should not be something that's only highlighted, and it's an important thing when it's in the media. Investing in transit should be a way of life. Spending money in transit as an investment should not be in any way think of as you should never, ever consider savings over safety. This is a priority for everybody. Transit is the lifeblood of the city and should continue to be invested in. As transit workers, we see this all the time. We want it to stop. We want to feel as though that we're partners in delivering this transit, but it should be safe. We want to feel as though partners, and it should be service there, a reliable service, to allow people to not feel as though they're alienated from the system. Right now we have a situation where they're cutting service. They're raising fares. And how are people going to feel protected when you're dealing with overcrowding, when you're dealing with lack of service, longer wait times for subways? It's going to create greater opportunities for conflict, and that conflict leads to opportunities for violence. These are things that need to be addressed and stopped. The public needs to understand, and transit workers already know, that we do not want to be feeling as though that the city and the province think of transit riders and transit workers as a disposable, renewable resource. People need to wake up. Right? Transit needs to be funded appropriately. Transit needs to be invested in, else these things are going to keep happening. Thoughts and prayers are a beautiful thing to hear, but we need action. We need people that have the opportunities to invest in transit, to put their best opportunities forward and try to invest in transit. We continually hear everybody talk about wanting to improve transit, but we need action. We need the province, we need the city, and we need the federal government to step up and provide the resources needed to protect everybody. And until that happens, I don't want to be at this podium again talking about thoughts and prayers. We want investment. We want these things to stop. Thank you.
Before we move to questions, I just want to underline it's the transit critic. I think you've heard loud and clear from the experts who understand how the system works that this is not normal. This is not normal, and we shouldn't accept it as being normal. At this point, I'd welcome any questions folks may have.
Can I get you to maybe elaborate a little bit? You said Doug Ford doesn't give a damn. That's a pretty strong statement to make. Tell us a bit more about why you feel that way.
Nothing has happened. Actions. This government hasn't showed any responsibility or any action on tackling these issues. In fact, a month and a half ago, we had a national task force meeting with provinces, and Ontario didn't show up to the table. It was this government who failed to show up to that table with ATU Canada and with other provinces across this country. I mean, I think it's irresponsible that the crisis is happening here in Ontario, like across the country. We invited representatives to join, and they failed to attend. And they failed to follow up to see what was going on and what our thought was and what kind of recommendations we were putting forward. There hasn't been an ounce of communication between this province and the national office.
Can you tell us a bit more about that meeting then? When did it happen? Who exactly did you invite?
We invited every province across this country to send representatives and stakeholders. I just don't have the date. Hold on.
Did it go to the premier's Office or the Minister of Transportation?
It would have gone to the Premier's office, and that meeting was held on February the 14th, 2023.
Did other provinces show up?
23 or 22?
February 14th, 2023. Saskatchewan showed up. Just give me 1 second here. Let me just get you the right name, so I don't want to... my apologies. That task force happened on February the 9th. The follow-up meeting was with my team. So that was February the 9th, 2023. Nova Scotia showed up, Saskatchewan showed up, Manitoba showed up, Newfoundland and Labrador, BC showed up, Ontario did not, nor did Alberta.
Did you get a response to the invitation saying they're declining, they were busy, or anything?
So Christine, let me just say her last name, Hogarth, attended for 30 seconds and then said she had to leave, and there was no follow-up from this government. And, we put a list of priorities together, things that we believe are going to be some of the things that will help mitigate some of these issues. We understand we're not going to eliminate violence in its totality across this country, but there are some best practices that we would like governments to consider. And what we want to do really is create a national strategy so that every government and every agency is not reacting to a one-off crisis. We need to establish a national template of what municipalities and transit agencies can adopt to mitigate some of the risks against our passengers and the workers.
And what are some of those best practices?
So some of the things that we've identified, and particularly here in the City of Toronto, let me just say this. I think it's unconscionable to think that a subway system in this city doesn't have cell phone networks. People who are in crisis have the need and have to be able to call 911. And as the City of Toronto cuts transit worker jobs, like the guard's position on subway trains, there's going to be less and less people to be able to deal with these acts of violence or people who are in difficulty. Instead of cutting jobs, let's put more people back onto the transit systems as workers for increased vigilance. It doesn't have to be police officers. As I sit here today and I mentioned the position of guard, the TTC is positioning itself to move itself to a one-person train on the TTC. I think it's a 500-foot train. An operator is driving at one end but can't see 500 feet behind them. Somebody pulls an alarm. Who's going to go and do that intervention? Who's going to assess that situation? Some of the other things that we want to talk about, of course, is the increased vigilance, dedicated constables.
We've been listening to the Ontario NDP alongside representatives of the ATU that represents transit workers, and they've been holding a press conference talking about their concerns around transit safety and some of the lack of support that they feel that they've received from the Ford government.